Hey, so welcome back to our series on body, mind and soul. Just to recap, if you missed last week or if you just can't remember because your brain's like just not working because you're homeschooling the crap out of yourself, we were looking at the idea of how it's really important to look care of our bodies, look after our bodies for a couple of reasons. We looked at it from two perspectives. One was kind of theologically and one was practically. And we looked at three real things. We looked at it's really important to look after our bodies because, like Flip, we are so well made by God. Two is that we house the Holy Spirit. That is the place where God chooses to dwell. And three is that our bodies offer back worship to Him. And so, of course, we want to look after them. And as well, we looked at it from the practical point of view of, well, it's just really good for us to look after our bodies, and it affects our minds and all sorts of parts of our lives as well as we look after our body. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at how we can look after our minds and why we should look after our minds. And gosh, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking there are so many different angles and ways that we could look at this. But we're going to look at it in two kind of ways again. And I'll get on to that in a second. But as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about our minds, there was a verse that just wouldn't escape me, two verses that just wouldn't escape me. And so I'm kind of going to base everything in there this evening. And so here's the verse that we're going to look at and we're going to base everything on. It's from Romans chapter 12, and it says this: "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." So there's loads in those two verses. And as you probably picked up, Paul again talks about like our bodies, but we're not going to go there. We're going to look at the stuff that he says about our minds. And there's loads in it and we could go loads of different ways with it, but I want to kind of try and keep it quite basic. And I want to just look at a couple of points. Again, we're going to look at the practicalities and we're going to look at the theological side of looking after our minds, i.e. why is it important practically, but also why is it important spiritually for us as well. And so as I look at these verses, Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I love that he says that. And in a minute, we're going to look at the real kind of contextual reason that he writes that. But I just couldn't get away from the fact that Paul says that, hey, you can be changed and you can be transformed by the renewing of your mind, i.e. the way you think about things can change things in a big way. And although he didn't mean it in this way, I was just thinking about it this week that actually how true that is, how we are actually able to be renewed by our thinking patterns. And as I was thinking about this thing is that we are actually able to change the way our brain works just by the way that we think. And that's not me kind of making something up. That's a thing called neuroplasticity, which means that we can actually change the way our brain fires and works and functions just by thinking. And actually there's a video link just in the comment section below, the description below about neuroplasticity. It's just 2 minutes. If it interests you, you can go and look at it after Youth Fellowship. But actually we can change our thinking and we can change how we feel just by the way we think about things. And so Paul's dead right that we can be renewed by our thinking and we can be renewed by how we use our minds. And so I want to look at this practically for 1 second. How can we change our minds? How can we change the way things are going for us? And so I want to look at two things. I want to remind us of this principle that we looked at last year in the Mind Matters series that we did in Youth Fellowship. That is that we use A, C, and E to try and help how we feel, to try and help how we think, because these promote good things in our minds. A stands for achievement, C stands for closeness, and E stands for enjoyment. And if we can just put some of those things in our day if we're feeling a bit blah, then actually what that does is that it creates things in our minds which just help us feel a bit better. So again, I want to remind you of that. The other thing that I want to remind you of, or say to you is that how we think about certain situations totally depends on how we feel about certain situations. And so here's an example from what I'm trying to say. Is that quite often when something happens, we have this automatic negative thinking towards something. Here's an example. I have wrecked my calf this week from running. And I caught myself kind of getting really down about it, really miserable about it. And so I'd wrecked my calf, and generally some of the thoughts that came into my mind were, I don't know if I'm going to be able to run again, this is awful, and it's going to really affect how I feel. And so those were some of the negative automatic thoughts. And then what happened was that I started to feel a bit rubbish. But then I started to change how I was thinking about it a little bit. Instead of kind of going, oh, I'm never going to run again, I was like, okay, injuries happen, and I've got over them before, and I've been able to run again. And that kind of made me feel a little bit better because I've just changed my thinking on it slightly. And there's loads of different examples. So say, for example, you've got loads of work. You can look at that loads of work and be like, there's so much, I'm not going to get through this work. And then you can start to feel a bit negative about yourself. But you can look at it a little bit differently and go, there's so much work here, I can do a little bit. And if I do a little bit, it might spur me on to do a bit more. And even if I do a little bit, well, there's less to do than there was before. And so we can change how we are by changing the approach of some of our thinking. And so I want to pause the video for just a little minute or two here. On your piece of paper, Ben's going to pop up a slide here, and it's going to be, what am I thinking really negatively about at the minute? And how could I change how I'm thinking about that? And so I want to encourage you to think about something that you're thinking quite negatively about, because automatically we can think negative thoughts. Take my example of the calf, for example. I was like just negative about it, but I changed my thoughts somewhat. It didn't change that my calf was wrecked, but it made me feel a little bit better towards it. So I want you to think about some things. I want you to think about, what are you thinking really negatively about at the minute? And how can you change your thinking about that in some way? Take a few minutes. So that's the practical side of stuff. And I really want to encourage you to do those two things as we look to kind of look after our minds. Try fill your day with that principle of A, C, and E, but also change how we're thinking about things. We think automatically so negatively sometimes, but we can change that, and it does affect how we feel. But I want to move on to the spiritual side of stuff, why it's important for our minds and to change our minds and renew our minds. Because Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But actually what's so important is the bit that he writes before this. And the bit that he writes before this is, in view of God's mercy. In view of God's mercy, it's time to change how you think. And one of the things that I really want to encourage us to do is to view ourselves in the light of God's mercy. what can happen is that we can feel pretty low, and then we start to think about ourselves really, really negatively. I know that sometimes when I get really low, I think about myself in that way. But Paul says this, changing our mind processes, we're to do it because of God's mercy. And so I want us to think about God's mercy for a second. I want us to think about the fact that we are loved and we are known and we are cared for by a God who created everything we see around us. That we are known and loved and accepted because Jesus died for us. In view of God's mercy, we need to have a different view of ourselves. He views us in a way that we don't view ourselves. And so sometimes we need to renew our minds by the way we think about ourselves too. And so again, Ben's going to pause the screen, and I want on one side for you to pop down some of the things I've been thinking about myself. And on the other side, I want you to then start to write some stuff in view of God's mercy. How does God think about you? Dougie started the communion service last week by asking everyone to say out loud to themselves that they are known and they are loved and they are cared by God. And so sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that. So in view of God's mercy, I want you to think about yourself, how God thinks about you, and not about yourself. Take a few minutes to do that. Lastly, Paul writes this about our renewing of our minds, because he does say this bit where he says, don't be conforming to the pattern of the world. And what that really means is that the world and people around us will think and act in very different ways. And he says that we need to be transformed in our minds. We need to start to think about things the way God thinks about things. Classic example, you look around, people don't kind of consider God in their everyday thinking. And so that's why we see people living in ways that are totally opposite to God. And we can fall into that pattern too. That's what Paul is saying. He says, like, listen, you can conform, you can become like this because that's the way everyone else is thinking. And so it can be a natural trap for you to fall into, to think about things in that way too. But he says we've got to continuously renew our minds. And so when we're renewing our minds, what that means is that when we're thinking about things and issues and how we live our life, is that we've got to think about it the way God thinks about it. And we're called to do that because we're called to live in ways that replicate and show God to this place. And so I want you to think about maybe one or two things where you may need to change your thinking on. I want you to think about a couple of things that you may need to shift your thinking patterns because you've become, well, maybe a little bit like everybody else on them, and you know that God has a different way. So here's a little example from my life from a couple of years ago. I used to kind of think to myself about money. I had to hold it quite tightly because, everybody wants money and all that kind of stuff. And then I realized that actually God calls me to give a lot of my money away. Not all of it, of course, because I've got people to feed at home. But he calls me to be less tight-fisted with my money and more generous. And so as a result of that, we set up a couple of direct debits where we would give some money automatically to good causes every month. That's not me saying any of that to pat myself on the back, but I had to renew my mind because God actually says no. He says something totally different to the way sometimes the world acts. So I want you to think about, how can you renew your mind? How can you look at, okay, I need to think about something a little bit differently so I don't conform, so I don't become like the rest of the world, but I actually act in the ways that God wants me to on this. Okay, so just a quick recap before we bounce back into the main room. Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And as I looked at earlier on, is that our brains are class, they can change themselves and we can renew them by our thinking patterns, that thing of neuroplasticity, and that helps us in our well-being and in our mental health. And so I want to encourage you to think about things differently, less so in an automatic negative fashion, and also kind of keep those principles of ACE through your day. They should help in how you renew your mind too. The other thing is that in view of God's mercy, look at yourself the way God looks at you. Sometimes we can just be so negative and down on ourselves, but in view of God's mercy, keep thinking to yourself about how God sees you. And lastly, we're also called to renew our minds to think a little bit more like God so that we can replicate the things that He wants in this earth. Hopefully that's been of help to you, and that has been the second part of our Body, Mind and Soul series. See you back in the main room.